The reflection in the polished mahogany table was distorted, but the faces were clear. Desperation had a universal look. On one side sat the Hayes family. Richard Hayes, the patriarch, his face a mask of false confidence, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Beside him his wife Helen, a woman who seemed to have faded into the background of her own life, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent boardroom. And their son Leo, arrogant even in defeat, his expensive suit looking more like a costume he could no longer afford. They were waiting for the final word from the person who held their entire world in her hands. The mysterious new majority shareholder of their failing company. The door opened with a soft, almost silent click. A woman walked in. She was not what they expected. She was young, her presence filling the room with a quiet authority that was both unnerving and captivating. She wore a simple, elegant, dark blue dress. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a face with features that were striking, yet hard to place. There was a story in her eyes, a depth that spoke of storms weathered and mountains climbed. She took her seat at the head of the table, her movements fluid and deliberate. She did not look at the papers in front of her. Instead, her gaze swept over the three faces watching her, lingering for a moment on each one. There was no anger in her eyes. There was something far more chilling. There was nothing. A calm, placid surface on a very deep ocean. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice smooth and even, betraying no emotion. "I have reviewed your proposal. I have read the reports. Your company is on the brink of collapse." Richard leaned forward, his voice strained. "We have a plan, a strategy to recover. We just need an extension. We need a little faith." He spoke of legacy, of a family business built from the ground up. He spoke of honor and commitment. The woman listened patiently, her expression unchanging. When he finished, a long silence stretched across the room. It was heavier than any argument. Helen wrung her hands in her lap. Leo shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice a soft murmur that cut through the tension like a knife. "You speak a lot about family, Mr. Hayes. You speak of legacy." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. A faint, almost imperceptible memory flickered behind her calm facade. The memory of a cold sidewalk, of falling rain, of a small hand reaching out for one that was already gone. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every word echoed in the silent room. "Tell me," she said, her gaze unwavering. "What is a daughter worth?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Richard Hayes stared back, confusion clouding his features. He did not understand the question. He did not see the ghost sitting across from him. He only saw a powerful stranger, a woman who held his future in her hands, and he had no idea that she had already lived the answer to her own question. Years before the glass and steel tower, before the name on her door commanded respect, there was only Alara. A small girl with wide, curious eyes living in a house that was far too large for laughter. The Hayes mansion was a masterpiece of architecture, with manicured lawns and gleaming floors. But it was a home without warmth. It was a museum of a family, where everything was for display and nothing was meant to be touched, least of all the heart. Alara's world was painted in shades of quiet observation. She learned early that her presence was tolerated, not celebrated. Her father, Richard, moved through the house like a king in a silent castle. His world was made of numbers and contracts, and he had no space for a daughter who preferred crayons to calculators. He saw her as a gentle, quiet thing, a flaw in the lineage he wanted to build, which was meant to be bold and aggressive, like his son. Leo was the son in the Hayes family solar system. He was 2 years older, and everything he did was a cause for celebration. A good grade on a test, a goal in a soccer game, these were monumental achievements. Richard would clap him on the back, his voice booming with pride. Helen, their mother, would flutter around him, her face alight with a love that was bright and unconditional. For Alara, there were only shadows. She was a talented artist. Her sketches were filled with life, with magical creatures and sun-drenched landscapes that existed only in her mind. They were her escape. But whenever she tried to show them to her father, he would barely glance up from his newspaper. "That is nice, Alara," he would say, the words empty, but it will not build an empire. Her mother was a more complicated pain. Helen had a softness to her, a deep-seated sadness in her eyes. There were fleeting moments, rare and precious, when she would brush Ilara's hair or read her a story, her voice a gentle melody. In those moments, Ilara felt a flicker of hope. But the moment Richard entered the room, the warmth would vanish. Helen would become timid and distant again, her fear of her husband a wall between her and her daughter. She was a prisoner in her own home, and she taught Ilara that a daughter's love was a secret to be hidden. So, Ilara learned to be invisible. She found comfort in the forgotten corners of the large house. The dusty attic, where beams of light cut through the gloom, became her art studio. The overgrown corner of the garden became her kingdom. Her only true friend was a stray cat with one torn ear, whom she named Patches. She would save scraps from her dinner and sneak them out, whispering all her secrets to the little creature who asked for nothing but a little kindness. She did not know it then, but this small act of caring for another living being was planting a seed of resilience in her heart. It was a tiny light in the growing darkness of her childhood. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was a day like any other, except that Richard was bringing home a potential business partner for dinner. This was not just any deal. It was a lifeline that could save his struggling company. The man was old-fashioned, a believer in tradition and strong family lines. Everything had to be perfect. Helen dressed Ilara in a stiff, uncomfortable dress, instructing her to be on her absolute best behavior. "Just be quiet," she had whispered, her hands trembling as she tied the ribbon in Ilara's hair. "Do not speak unless you are spoken to, and smile." Ilara tried. She sat at the long dining table, her back straight, her hands in her lap. She watched her father laugh at the guests' jokes. She watched Leo charm everyone with practiced ease. She felt like a ghost at the feast, a tiny shadow in a room full of bright lights. The mistake, when it happened, was small and accidental. As she reached for her water glass, her elbow was nudged, just slightly, by her brother Leo, who was making a show of reaching for the salt. The nudge was almost invisible, a tiny act of malice that no one else would ever notice. But it was enough. Ilara's glass tipped. Water, crystal clear and devastating, spilled across the pristine white tablecloth and onto the guest's trousers. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The guest looked down in shock. Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Leo's face was a perfect picture of feigned innocence, but it was her father's face that Ilara would never forget. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, contained rage that was more terrifying than any shouting. The deal was dead. She could see it in his eyes. The rest of the evening was a blur of forced apologies and a hasty departure. The moment the front door closed, the storm broke. But it was a silent storm. Richard did not raise his voice. He simply turned to his wife and said, "Pack her a bag, a small one." Ilara did not understand. She thought she was being sent to her grandmother's house as punishment. She sat in the back of the family's luxury car, clutching a small bag with a change of clothes and her favorite sketchbook. Helen sat in the front, staring straight ahead, silent tears tracing paths down her cheeks. She never once looked back. They drove for a long time, into a part of the city Ilara had never seen before. The grand houses gave way to smaller, unfamiliar buildings. Richard pulled the car over to the side of a dimly lit street. He turned around, his face unreadable in the faint glow of the streetlights. "Get out of the car, Ilara." His voice was calm. That was the most terrifying part. A small, confused sound escaped her lips. "But where are we?" "This is where you belong," he said, his words like chips of ice. "With the other mistakes. You have been a burden since the day you were born. A flaw. I am correcting it." He pushed a few folded bills into her hand. "You are no longer a Hayes. You are no longer our daughter." He turned away and the car began to move. Ilara stood frozen on the pavement, watching the red taillights shrink in the distance. She watched as the car turned a corner and disappeared, taking with it every piece of the world she had ever known. The city hummed with a life that did not know she existed. The night air was cold, and she was utterly, completely alone. The first few hours were a blur of cold and fear. Ilara found a bus stop with a small bench underneath an awning and huddled there, pulling her knees to her chest. The city was a monster made of roaring engines and strange, flickering lights. Every person who walked by was a potential threat, a giant in a world that was no longer her size. She clutched her sketchbook to her chest, the smooth paper a familiar comfort in a world that had become sharp and terrifying. Hunger eventually became a pain that was stronger than fear. She remembered the money in her pocket. With trembling hands, she walked into a small all-night diner and bought a piece of toast. She ate it slowly, trying to make it last forever. The warmth in her stomach was a temporary truce with the world, but the money ran out in 2 days. Soon the gnawing emptiness returned, and it brought with it a cold, hard despair. She learned to be invisible. She learned which alleyways were quiet and which ones to avoid. She learned that people rarely looked down, and that if she stayed small and silent, she could almost disappear. But she was still a child. It was a kind-faced police officer who eventually found her, sleeping behind some bins, her face smudged with dirt. The place they took her was called the Northwood Children's Home. It was a large, imposing brick building that smelled of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. It was a place of safety, but it was not a home. Here, she was no longer Ilara. She was a case number. Her story was written down in a file, and she was given a bed in a long room filled with other lost children. Life in Northwood was a lesson in survival of a different kind. There were bullies who would steal your food, and older kids who saw sadness as a weakness to be exploited. Ilara, with her quiet nature, was an easy target. She retreated further into herself, her sketchbook becoming her only sanctuary. In its pages, she could create worlds where she was safe, where families were kind, and where little girls were not left on street corners. The other children did not understand her art. They saw it as strange. One day, a group of older boys cornered her in the yard. They snatched the sketchbook from her hands. For a moment she fought back with a ferocity that surprised them all, but she was too small. They laughed as they tore out the pages one by one, letting the wind carry her magical creatures and sun-drenched landscapes away like fallen leaves. That was the day something inside Ilara truly broke. Watching her drawings scatter across the concrete, she was not just losing pictures. She was losing the last piece of the girl she used to be. The hope she had secretly held on to, the tiny, foolish belief that her parents would realize their mistake and come back for her, finally dissolved. As she stood there empty-handed, surrounded by the scraps of her imagination, she understood. No one was coming for her. Her journey was now truly and completely her own. The years at Northwood bled into one another, each one a different shade of grey. Ilara grew from a lost child into a quiet, watchful teenager. The fire in her had not gone out, but it had been banked low, a bed of coals hidden beneath a layer of ash. She learned to be resilient in the way that neglected things are, like a weed growing through a crack in the pavement. She did her chores, she did her schoolwork, and she kept to herself. She never drew again. The world had shown her that creating beautiful things was an invitation for them to be destroyed. Her lowest point arrived when she was 16. A small sum of money went missing from the home's office, and a girl with a grudge against Ilara pointed the finger at her. No one listened to her denials. They saw a quiet, withdrawn girl and decided she was secretive and deceitful. Her punishment was a week of isolation and extra chores, but the real punishment was the reinforcement of her father's final words, that she was a mistake, a flaw, unworthy of trust. For that entire week she felt a profound and terrifying emptiness. It felt like the end of the road. She had no family. She had no friends. And now the very system that was supposed to protect her saw her as a criminal. She was completely adrift, and the darkness of the street corner from all those years ago felt closer than ever. It was in the home's small, dusty library that the turning point finally came. She was hiding there, not to read, but simply to be away from the accusing eyes of the others. She ran her hand along a shelf of donated, forgotten books and pulled one out at random. It was not a novel or a book of poetry. It was an old textbook on market economics. She opened it expecting to be bored, but she was not. She saw charts, graphs, and theories. She read about supply and demand, assets and liabilities, strategy and foresight. It was a language of logic, of cause and effect. It was a world completely removed from the chaos and injustice of her own life. And in that cold, clean logic, she found a strange comfort. A thought, small at first, began to grow in her mind. This was the world her father lived in. This was the game he played. He had used his power, built on these very principles, to discard her. What if she could learn that language? What if she could understand those rules, not just to survive, but to build something of her own? A switch flipped inside her. The despair began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. She would not be a victim. She would be a student. She began to read everything she could find on business, finance, and corporate strategy. She filled notebooks not with drawings, but with business plans and market analyses. The library became her classroom. The knowledge she gained became her armor. She was no longer just surviving. She was preparing. For the first time since she was a little girl, Ilara had found a new way to create a world for herself, not on paper, but in the reality that had once tried to crush her. Knowledge alone was not enough to escape the walls of Northwood. As Ilara approached her 18th birthday, the day she would age out of the system and be cast back into the world, a quiet panic began to set in. She had a mind full of strategies, but her pockets were empty. She was a general with no army. Her ally, when he appeared, was not the one she would have expected. It was Mr. Henderson, the elderly volunteer librarian at the home. He was a quiet man with kind eyes who had spent years watching children pass through Northwood's revolving doors. He had noticed Ilara. He saw a girl who was not just hiding in the library, but studying with a fierce, unwavering intensity. He saw the notebooks filled with complex formulas and market projections, and he recognized something extraordinary, a brilliant mind trapped by circumstance. One afternoon, a week before her 18th birthday, he approached her. "I have a friend," he said, his voice gentle. "He built his company from nothing. He understands what it is like to fight for a place in the world. He sponsors a scholarship for exceptional young people. I told him about you." Ilara was skeptical. The world had taught her that kindness often came with a price, but Mr. Henderson was persistent, and she had no other options. The meeting was arranged. The man's name was Arthur Sterling. He was the CEO of a major investment firm, a name that commanded respect throughout the city. The meeting took place not in a cold boardroom, but in a small, comfortable office filled with books. Mr. Sterling was an older man, with a warm smile that did not quite hide the sharpness in his eyes. He did not ask about her past or where she came from. Instead, he asked about the books she had been reading. He challenged her ideas, questioned her strategies, and listened intently to her answers. For an hour they spoke a language that no one else in Ilara's life had ever understood. He saw past the scared orphan, and saw the brilliant strategist she was becoming. He saw her hunger for knowledge, not just as a means of escape, but as a passion. In her, he saw a reflection of his own younger self. At the end of the meeting, he leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Henderson was right," he said. "You have a remarkable mind." He offered her not just the scholarship, which would cover her university education in business and finance, but also a paid internship at his firm. It was more than a lifeline. It was a key. It was a chance to turn all her theoretical knowledge into real-world power. Ilara walked out of that building into the bright afternoon sun, and for the first time the world did not feel like a threat. It felt like an opportunity. She was no longer alone. She had found someone who saw her not for the dirt on her face or the file in a cabinet, but for the fire in her mind. Arthur Sterling became more than a mentor. He became the father figure she never had, the first person to believe that she was not a mistake, but a masterpiece waiting to be revealed. Richard Hayes stared, bewildered by the woman's question. "What is a daughter worth?" He forced a short, nervous laugh. "I am not sure I understand. This is a business negotiation. We are talking about profit margins, about debt restructuring." The woman, Ilara, did not smile. She held his gaze, and the placid calm in her eyes began to ripple, revealing the immense depth of history that lay beneath. "Of course," she said softly. "Business. Let us talk about assets. An asset is something of value, something you keep, something you nurture so it will grow. And a liability, that is something that costs you, something you cut loose so it does not drag you down. Her eyes drifted from Richard to his son, Leo. Some investments look promising. A golden boy, a perfect heir. You give him everything, the best schools, the best clothes. You celebrate his minor victories. But you overlook the flaws in his character, his casual cruelty, his belief that he is entitled to everything. She paused, letting the words sink in. And when the investment fails to mature, when his arrogance and poor decisions run the family legacy into the ground, you are left with nothing. Leo paled, the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Ilara's gaze then softened, but only slightly as it fell upon Helen. The older woman flinched as if she had been touched. And then there are the silent partners, Ilara continued, her voice filled with a sorrow that was centuries old. The ones who enable the bad decisions, the ones who stand by and watch as something precious is thrown away because they are too afraid to speak. Their silence is the highest price of all. Helen began to tremble, a choked sob caught in her throat. Recognition was dawning in her eyes, a terrible, gut-wrenching understanding. Finally, Ilara looked back at Richard. His face was a thundercloud of confusion and rage. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "What is this?" "I'm a liability that became an asset," Ilara said, her voice now as cold and sharp as glass. "I am the mistake you tried to correct on the corner of Oakhaven and 12th Street. I am the girl you left in the rain with $50 and the belief that she was worthless." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Helen's open weeping. Richard's face went white. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw. He saw the ghost of the child he had abandoned, now wearing the face of the woman who had just bought his world. "No," he whispered, "it cannot be." "You threw me away," Ilara stated, her voice steady, devoid of the tears they expected. "But others saw my value." Arthur Sterling did not see a flaw. He saw a mind. He invested in me. He nurtured me. And I grew. She gestured around the boardroom. "This is the result of that growth. Your company is failing because you put your faith in the wrong heir. You gambled on arrogance and discarded dedication." She stood up, her presence seeming to grow, filling the entire room. "I am not here to destroy this company. I am here to rebuild it. I am here to save the jobs of the hundreds of employees you were about to fail. You wanted a legacy, Richard. You wanted an empire." She looked down at the three broken people, the family that had been a museum of lies. "You just never realized which of your children was capable of building one." There was no shouting, no final desperate plea. The truth had left no room for arguments. Ilara, now in complete control, addressed her former family with a calm finality. "You will be given a severance package that is fair but not generous. You will vacate the company premises immediately. Security will escort you." They left the boardroom not as a family, but as three separate, broken individuals. Richard walked with the shuffling gait of a defeated man, his eyes hollow. He had built his life on the illusion of strength, and now, with that illusion shattered, there was nothing left. His justice was not poverty, but irrelevance. He would have to live out his days knowing that the empire he treasured was now being run, and run better, by the daughter he had deemed worthless. Leo, stripped of his title and his future, was simply a lost boy. He had no skills, no drive, and the Hayes name was now a liability, not an asset. His justice was to be forced to face a world that did not owe him anything, a world where he would have to start from the very bottom, a place Ilara knew all too well. Helen was the last to leave. She paused at the door and turned back, her face a mess of tears and decades of regret. "Ilara," she whispered, the name a painful, unfamiliar sound on her tongue. "Can you ever—" She could not finish the sentence. Ilara looked at the woman who was her mother. She felt not anger, but a profound and distant sadness. "My life has been about moving forward," Ilara said, her voice gentle but firm. "I cannot look back." What you are looking for is not something I can give you. You must find it within yourself." With a final sad nod, Helen turned and walked away, left alone with the ghost of her own choices. With the past finally behind her, Ilara turned to the future. She called a meeting with the company's department heads, the people whose livelihoods had been hanging in the balance. They were expecting a ruthless new owner, a corporate raider who would sell the company for parts. Instead, they found a leader who was prepared, intelligent, and visionary. She spoke not of profits but of potential. She laid out a clear, innovative plan for the company's recovery. She showed them that she was not there to settle a score, but to build a legacy of true value. In that meeting, fear was replaced with respect, and respect quickly turned into loyalty. Later that evening, Ilara stood alone in what was once her father's office. The name on the door was already being replaced. She looked out the large window at the city lights twinkling below. The war was over. She had not just conquered her past, she had transformed it. The pain had been forged into strength, the loneliness into independence. She felt no giddy triumph, no bitter satisfaction. Instead, she felt a deep, quiet peace. The circle was now closed. 2 years passed. Under Ilara's leadership, the company did not just recover, it flourished. She became known as one of the most innovative and ethical leaders in her field. She led with a quiet strength and a deep empathy for her employees, creating a workplace that was built on respect, not fear. The empire was stronger than ever, but it was now an empire of integrity. Her life, once so small and grey, was now filled with colour. She lived in a house that was elegant but warm, with large windows that let in the morning sun. And in the brightest room of the house, there was an art studio. Canvases and sketchbooks filled the space. She had started drawing again, not to escape the world but to celebrate it. Her art was no longer about lonely kingdoms, but about the beauty she found in everyday life. The city skyline at dawn, the face of a smiling stranger, the simple joy of a flower growing in a garden. Arthur Sterling remained her closest friend and confidant. He would often visit her and they would talk for hours, not just about business but about life. He was immensely proud of her success, but he was even more proud of the person she had become. A woman who had faced the worst of humanity and had chosen to answer with the best of it. She never forgot where she came from. One of her first major philanthropic acts was the creation of the Henderson Foundation, named after the kind librarian who had first seen her potential. The foundation provided scholarships, mentorship programs, and resources for children aging out of the foster care system. She made sure that Northwood Children's Home had a brand new, fully stocked library, a place of sanctuary and possibility for other quiet children who were dreaming of a different life. One sunny afternoon, Ilara sat in her studio, a new sketchbook open on her lap. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She was sketching a landscape from memory, a quiet corner of a garden with a majestic oak tree. But this time in the drawing, a little girl was not hiding in the shadows. She was sitting in the sunlight, smiling, with a small, one-eared cat purring in her lap. A soft, genuine smile touched Ilara's lips. The ghosts of the past were finally quiet. She had not erased her scars. She had turned them into a map that had led her home to herself. She was not the abandoned child, nor the vengeful CEO. She was simply Ilara. And for the first time in her life, that was more than enough. And so we close the book on Ilara's incredible journey, a story that began in heartbreak on a cold city street and ended in a sunlit room, filled with peace and purpose. Her story is a powerful reminder that our beginnings do not have to define our endings. It shows us that the deepest wounds can sometimes lead to the greatest strengths, and that the family we choose can often be more powerful than the family we are born into. Ilara's victory was not in the destruction of those who wronged her, but in the construction of a better life, not just for herself, but for many others. She transformed her pain into a legacy of hope. And now we want to hear from you. What part of Ilara's story resonated with you the most? Was it the moment she found purpose in that dusty library, or the quiet strength she showed when she finally faced her past? We all face moments of injustice or feel unseen in our lives. How do you think we can find the strength to build ourselves back up when we feel like we have been cast aside. Share your thoughts and your own stories of resilience in the comments section below. We truly believe that every comment is a story in itself, and we read each one. Your words and experiences create a community and inspire every story we tell. If Ilara's journey from being a forgotten child to a compassionate leader moved you, please show your support by giving this video a thumbs up. Liking the video helps our channel grow and lets us know that you connect with these tales of the human spirit. And if you are new to our channel, welcome. We are so happy you found us. Consider subscribing and becoming a part of our community. We share powerful stories like this one every week. Stories that remind us of the strength, kindness, and hope that exists in the world. Make sure to also click the notification bell so you never miss a moment or a new story that is waiting to be told. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until our next story, remember that your own legacy is being written with every choice you make.